Hi, we're going to be doing our Period 6 review here. Period 6, again, encompasses 1865 to 1898, so it's not Reconstruction history, but it's post-Civil War history through about the turn of the century. This is the Gilded Age. I made you an overview here, a little outline. I wanted to make you the video here so that we could really break down what the time period was and what it meant to American history, and so that you can be ready for your test tomorrow. This obviously no two-page outline is going to adequately give you everything you need to know about an entire 40-year chunk of history. But I tried to break down the big cultural changes, the big social changes, economic changes, political changes, and put that in here for you so that you'll be prepared for your test. So an overview, a couple of big, huge, sweeping changes in America. You have the Second Industrial Revolution. During this time period, America becomes the world's largest economy by 1900, again, greater than Great Britain, France, and Germany combined. The average American's standard of living and wealth increases during this time period. Don't get me wrong, not everybody's life improves. However, a majority of Americans' lives greatly improve through technological innovations, more job opportunities, increased urbanization, better transportation. Immigration, people are coming to this country by the millions. Ellis Island being the big destination on the East Coast and Angel Island on the West Coast. A majority of people at this time are coming here from South and Eastern Europe, bringing their culture, their customs, their religion, their food, all that kind of stuff with them. And because the cities grow and the face of America is changing. So let's break it down section by section here again. There's 10 sections in period 6. So we'll start with the first, westward expansion and American Indian resistance. So the Indian Wars this time, the America is shifting westward. The frontier is closing down. There are still several 100,000 Native Americans in the West. They've been put on reservations through the Treaty of Fort Laramie and the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie. But with the increased desire for Americans to settle lands that were inhabited by Native Americans, discoveries of things like gold, copper, zinc, these different mines out west, they're being pushed off of their land in greater numbers. So Native Americans begin to fight back, late 1860s, 1870s. The high watermark for the American Indian resistance is Custer's last stand, or the Battle of Little Bighorn in southern Montana, where Sitting Bull and his Indian army defeat the American army. That's the last victory for the Indians in the Indian Wars. By 1890, which is considered to be the final battle of the Indian Wars, you have the Battle of Wounded Knee, where you have an American army that unfortunately massacres a group of mostly women, children, and elderly men. In 1887, you have the Dawes Act that gets passed. This kicks Indians off of reservations and tries to put them onto private properties, kind of like the Homestead Act from 1862, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Native Americans are losing their culture as many of the Indian children are forced into boarding schools. The buffalo population out west is decimated by hunting, and so their way of life as they know it is changed. And again, by 1890, there is no frontier anymore on the American census, so that's kind of symbolic of America now dominating coast to coast. All right, industry in the West. Westward expansion, you had the Homestead Act of 1862 that was passed during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, where Americans would get 160 acres of land out west as long as they improved that land within 5 years, and they had to pay a $10 filing fee. So it was effectively free. To get there, early on, we talked about the Oregon Trail, we talked about, the ox carts, the carrying people very slowly out west. Well, now you get the railroads, the Iron Horse that's taking Americans westward. By 1869, you have a transcontinental railroad. By 1880, you have 5 transcontinental railroads. Railroads are extraordinarily powerful in many ways. They're granted land by the federal government. Farmers absolutely hate this, obviously, because a lot of that land goes through these farmers' fields. Any city that grows out west has to be directly on a railroad because this is the transportation that it replaces the old river system that was the early highways of America. The railroads were so powerful that they created the time zones that we enjoy today. It helped to standardize time, standardize shipping, etc. All right, out west also you have a lot of mining. You have gold, silver, zinc, copper, different mines, places like Montana, Idaho, Colorado. California obviously started the mining boom with the California gold rush. Let's move on to section 6-3. All right, the New South. the new South after the Civil War is trying to redefine. The South is trying to redefine its image through industrialization, and so they see the future of the South in industry. In the South, you're not going to see the same number of immigrants go to the South. You're not going to see wages as high in the South because the business climate is very much different down there. Another hallmark of the New South is the end of Reconstruction, and therefore you see the rise of Jim Crow laws. So Jim Crow laws are separate but equal laws. Things like voting. With voting, with Jim Crow, I'm sorry, with voting's not a Jim Crow law. Jim Crow laws will be separate but equal, like bathrooms, restaurants, swimming areas, etc. But then you have limits to voting, like the grandfather clause, literacy tests, poll taxes. By the turn of the 20th century, most African Americans in the South have been disenfranchised, so they are effectively second-class citizens. And then Plessy versus Ferguson, the infamous Supreme Court decision from 1896, pretty much gets the Supreme Court's stamp of approval that separate but equal is the law of the land in the South. And that's not going to be overturned until Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. 6-4, America industrializes. We have our country has a Republican-dominated government through the Gilded Age. And one of the hallmarks of Republican government at this time is the rise of corporations, making it easier for corporations to grow and to thrive. And again, the economy at this time is booming. So you have these corporations growing. You have trusts that are developing. When you hear the word trust, just think monopoly. So you have men like John Rockefeller with Standard Oil, Andrew Carnegie with Carnegie Steel. You've got J.P. Morgan, who's the financier to the stars. You know, the guy that put together General Electric in 1893 with Edison's inventions. He bought Carnegie Steel in 1901 and created U.S. Steel. These are men who historically have been known as one of two things, either robber barons or captains of industry. Robber barons, people that believe they're robber barons would point to the fact that they're crushing competition with these trusts and with all these forced mergers and these predatory business practices, driving people out of business so that they could take their share of the business. If they're captains of industry, you might look to their philanthropic record of giving a lot of their money away, of creating millions of jobs, of improving the standard of living for the average American. So it's up to you to determine what you believe these men were. You had vertical integration, you had horizontal integration. Vertical integration was Carnegie Steel, where you control everything from top to bottom, the raw materials to the production to the distribution of the materials, whereas horizontal integration is John Rockefeller's Standard Oil. It's the oil field, the oil field, the oil field, the oil field. You want all of the oil. So just to make very, very more complex systems very simplistic. Then you got the Sherman Antitrust Act that came out in 1890. This act was supposed to limit trusts and monopolies, but in fact, the corporations themselves were able to take this and use this to their advantage and actually helped to grow their businesses versus hurt them. And yeah. All right, let's move on to 6-5 here, working people organize. So there is a destabilizing effect of the growth of corporations. Life changes very rapidly. As we know, growing in the 21st century, technological changes have completely, overthrown the old business models. Companies like Amazon have shuttered, smaller businesses because it's much easier to go online and shop than it is to actually, get dressed, get in the car, drive to the store, shop. Especially with COVID right now, you have a lot of people who are looking at shopping differently, at retail differently. Well, at this time period, you have people who had maybe grown up in an agrarian culture. Now it's becoming a rapidly industrialized culture, or people who used to be their own bosses that now have to work for a manager in a factory. Life is changing rapidly, and there are people that are either resisting the change or working with the change, but saying that the change needs to look at workers differently too, and workers needed to be treated more fairly. So you have the rise of labor unions. One of the first big strikes in American history was in 1877. There was a railroad strike. There was a panic of 1873, so there was a nearly decades-long depression in the 1870s. So labor unions were showing their strength and unity by striking in 1877. This was a violent strike, and there were people that died from this, and it threatened to shut down the railroad industry for a period of time. But then you have labor unions like the Knights of Labor, the American Federation of Labor, and the International Workers of the World, or the IWW. They're the big unions of their time. The Knights of Labor was the first big union. It was open to almost everybody, except for the Chinese. We talked about how Asian Americans this time were not treated with a lot of dignity and respect. The Knights of Labor dominated the labor union the labor union movement until 1886 at the Haymarket Square massacre, when there was a police protest and somebody threw dynamite at the police and there was an explosion. Policemen fired into the crowd, and the Knights of Labor and other unions were blamed for it, and so their roles diminished at that time. The American Federation of Labor is a craft union led by a man named Samuel Gompers, which is more, they're pushing for things like an 8-hour workday, better working conditions, workmen's compensation, more things that we have today. They were kind of the forerunner to that. Then you have big strikes this time, like the Homestead Steel Strike in Pittsburgh. You watched the video on that one with Andrew Carnegie's Steelworks and Henry Clay Frick bringing the Pinkerton detectives to shut down the strike and pretty much crushed the union at Homestead. You had the Pullman strike in 1894, the Pullman Luxury Railroad Company, and when Grover Cleveland had the National Guard come in to put down that strike. So working people are organizing, but labor unions at this time are not going to be as successful as they will become in the 20th century. Moving on to 6-6, we have a new wave of immigrants coming into this country, mostly, again, from South and Eastern Europe. There were, again, West Coast Asians coming to this country through Angel Island. We won't focus on that because Asian immigration is much less than European immigration. And if you look down at this Chinese Exclusion Act, that would effectively cut off Chinese immigrants as of 1882. And by 1908, you get the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan. So fewer Asian immigrants coming in, tons from South and Eastern Europe. These Southern and Eastern Europeans that are coming to America are mostly Catholic. There are Jewish people coming too, but with Catholics coming here, you have a different view on religion, different view on drinking, different cultural customs. And this is going to throw a lot of people in America who had been born and raised here and had their roots more in North and Western Europe for a loop. So you have a nativist movement that grows to combat these people coming in with their new ideas and cultures and customs. So their welcome is not necessarily the warmest welcome. It's going to take them a few generations to really merge into American society full force. The average immigrant's desire when they came here was not to come here to forget their homeland, to forget their way of life. It was to come here to make money, to go back to Europe, to buy land and settle down, to raise themselves up in the economic and social classes of Europe. The average immigrant did not go back to Europe. There were still several million people that were able to fulfill that dream, but the average American came here and they stayed. When they came here, they would cluster into ethnic, what some would call ethnic enclaves, different chunks of the city where you'd have people of Italian ancestry or Polish ancestry or Russian ancestry that would cluster into these areas of cities near their job, because a lot of factories were employed predominantly one or two different nationalities over another. And a lot of them spoke their own languages. They read native language newspapers. They had celebrations in America as they would have in Europe. They're trying to keep their homeland's culture going in America while also trying to what we call Americanize by learning English, by learning American culture and customs as well. So we get that whole idea of the melting pot theory where you throw everybody's culture into one big pot, stir it up, and you kind of have one homogenous outcome. The book talks about a vegetable soup of different people's cultures and customs, kind of each being unique, but each adding to the flavor of American culture. My college professor, if you remember, talked about a mosaic where each country's culture and custom adds to the big picture of things, and they remain unique, but part of the bigger picture of America. So however you want to remember it is fine. Just understand that immigration is going to completely redefine the face in the culture of the United States. Most of these immigrants are moving to East Coast and Midwestern American cities. Urbanization is growing by leaps and bounds. Again, it's not just immigrants coming to cities. You also have, I should add this to our list here, you have Southern African Americans who are coming to the north, and you also have sons of farmers and daughters of farmers who are moving to the cities in order to make a way of life, because farming at this time, there's still a lot of Americans who are farmers working in agriculture, but the technology has changed so much that there's not as much opportunity as there once was. So you have a growth in cities. With that, you have to find a place to house them. You have tenements that are built. These are cheap apartments where you have multiple families oftentimes living in one room. You have communal bathrooms. If you're lucky to have indoor plumbing. If not, you have outhouses outside, which is oftentimes near a water source. So you have a lot of people getting sick drinking contaminated water. In the cities, because there's not as much room to expand anymore, because cities only have so much land, now they're starting to grow up. You have the first skyscraper in American history in 1885 in Chicago, the Home Insurance Building. What allows these skyscrapers to be built? You've got steel girders and frames that are being built. You have elevators that allow for buildings to be built up instead of cities moving outward. You have better transportation. So these people who had money that used to live near their jobs downtown are now moving to what we call suburbs. They have things like elevated trains or L trains that are taking them from their house to their job. You have subways. The first subway in America is 1897 in Boston. By 1904, you've got New York City subway system, trolley cars, streetcars, things like that. So better transportation within the cities. A lot of these cities are run by corrupt governments, run by political machines, the most famous being Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall. Let's move on to 6-8, society and culture in Gilded Age. Keep in mind, all these technological innovations. You got Edison's light bulb in 1879. By the 1880s, 1890s, cities themselves are electrified. Wealthier people are getting them into their homes. The phonograph, you have recorded sound. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone in 1876 revolutionizes the way that we communicate. You have mail order catalogs. So I have mail order catalogs here. Sears, Montgomery Ward being the most famous catalogs of their time. Think of Amazon today. If you want to look something up, you type it in the search bar on Amazon, and you have all these different options. The Sears catalog is like the Amazon of its day. You could live in a rural part of America, and you can order from this catalog and have the same luxuries and the same consumer products that you would have to live near cities to have gotten at one time. So this helps to kind of takes regional cultures and kind of nationalizes them. Baseball becomes the America's national pastime at this time. People are playing it. Rich people are playing it. Poor people are playing it. Urban people are playing it. Kids on farms are playing it. Vaudeville becomes a way for immigrants and working class people to go and enjoy entertainment, whereas the wealthy people might be going to see Broadway plays. Dance halls are being popular this time. The birth rate is dropping because people don't need as many children to do labor anymore. So even on farms, you see birth rates dropping. Marriage rates are dropping during this time period. Women are moving to cities and trying to make a life for themselves in ways that were not available to them 20, 30 years prior. So marriage and birth rates are dropping. The ideologies of the Gilded Age, we're focusing on ideologies as far as how people at the top would see the world. We have the eugenics movement, where people are being classified based on their race, being classified based on what part of Europe they come from. It's a pseudoscience. It's a science that we no longer subscribe to, but it would create a racial hierarchy that puts people from Northwestern Europe at the top of the racial scale. You have social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is the belief that you have Herbert Spencer and Charles Darwin's theories, and you combine them into people are wealthy because it's the survival of the fittest. They have the best ideas. They work the hardest. So, you have to have people at the bottom doing the menial jobs too. So think of it as like a pyramid of success. And social Darwinism would have been it would have been something that guys like Andrew Carnegie would have believed in. And Andrew Carnegie even wrote his Gospel of Wealth in 1889, talking about the role of the wealthy in this country. Charity is bad, but philanthropy is good. Give people in the lower classes the framework of the foundation to improve their own lives. That's why he would have built so many libraries, parks, concert halls, because that gives people access to things that can improve their lives and improve their and it can get them thinking differently, and hopefully they can pull themselves out of their poverty. The last section is politics and protest. So the presidents in order from this time, you got Grant, you got Hayes, you got Garfield. Cleveland is the only Democrat. Then you have Harrison, Cleveland again, and William McKinley. So Grover Cleveland, that fun fact, the only president in history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. So the Congress and the presidency were dominated at this time by the Republican Party. Some big changes to the way that the spoil system works. In 1883, you had the Pendleton Civil Service Act. 2 years prior, you had James Garfield, who was assassinated by Charles Guiteau, who was a disgruntled office seeker. He wanted the fruits of the spoil system. That may have helped push this through. The tariff at this time, the Republicans wanted tariffs because the tariffs protected big business, whereas the Democrats opposed the tariffs because they said that tariffs drive the price of goods up. You have 2 economic depressions during this time, the Panic of 1873 and the Panic of 1893. We have a laissez-faire economy at this time where the government does not regulate business, so you have booms and you have busts. 6-10 highlights a lot of the plight of the farmers. Crop prices are dropping because of more international competition. And because of this, farmers have to sell more than they used to. They're increasing production, which drives the price even further down. You have fewer people working in agriculture because of all the technological innovations. So farmers themselves feel left out. In the Midwest, you have the populist movement that grows. 1892, they run a third-party candidate, James Weaver. He wins 1,000,000 votes, which is not necessarily a substantial amount in the big scheme of things, but they're winning some governorships, they're winning some state houses, some Senate seats, some House seats. They prove that they're a force to be reckoned with. By 1896, the Democrats merge with the Populist Party. They run William Jennings Bryan, who is the 36-year-old from Nebraska who is trying to push bimetallism. Our money this time is based off of gold. He wants to be based off of gold and silver, which will inflate money, which will get more printed money in circulation, which will help people in poverty, help the urban working class. It will help farmers. So he goes around the country giving speech after speech after speech, promoting his candidacy. Whereas you have William McKinley, who has the power of big business behind him, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Morgans. His campaign is run by an industrialist in Cleveland named Mark Hanna. So you got money versus, well, depending on how you view it, you have populists versus big business running against each other this time. McKinley does win the election of 1896. The Depression of the 1890s ends with the discovery of gold in Alaska in 1897. Internationally, there's some crop failures, so American farm prices go back up again. So by the turn of the 20th century, the American economy has rebounded. Good luck on your test tomorrow. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me.